We'll begin the second part and hand over to Victoria Shotto from GIA, who actually got this whole thing going some months ago when she joined the Daylight Group committee. So, Victoria.
Yeah, so with this idea of aligning research and practice, the Daylight Group decided to invite the public to take part in a broad consultation regarding the key research gaps that practitioners would like to see addressed in terms of daylight science. And apparently, no surprise, there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of them. So far today, we've seen what people in daylight science are currently doing and what they have done. And now we're going to see what people out there in the public are actually looking forward to see in a near future, hopefully. So I will now present the outcomes of this consultation. And for that, we've decided to categorize all the responses that we've got into different themes, which are basically metrics, view out, perception, psychophysiological effects, post-occupancy evaluation studies, and what I've called planning matters. So starting with the topic of metrics, some awareness have been raised mostly by practitioners regarding the need for understandability and meaningfulness in daylight simulation outputs, including visualization tools or visualization of results. In line with this, the need for research or people in daylight science to tackle and articulate uncertainties in daylight calculation methods, including but not limited to sky models, characterization of materials and architectural elements, or, for example, the selection, the criteria behind the selection of weather files. There is a vast array of resources available out there and potentially some discrepancies between values that these weather files provide. So what to do about it? Also connected to this, further exploration on the capabilities and validation of climate-based daylight modeling, which I'm sure John will talk about that later on today, maybe. Someone also reflected on the, let's put it like that, on the age of the minimum levels of the requirements set in the national annex that we use in practice, and whether these can still be considered acceptable based on nowadays perception of what is daylight adequacy. I've actually skipped one, which is the one addressing the lack of consideration of shading systems in annual calculations, in annual simulations of daylight. And finally, the need for further development regarding assessments of glint and glare for aviation purposes, which is particularly relevant for hospitals, for example, or for the expanding industry of solar farms. Now moving on to the next topic, which is view out. Of course, with the new European Daylight Standard, the importance of view out is on the rise. And so we have seen questions around the fact that more holistic approaches are needed to evaluate view quality and its integration into the design process, but also evaluation methods that could help us decide, that could help us evaluate the effects of good versus bad quality views. And linking back to the previous topic of metrics, if we do consider and include any form of shading system in our daylight calculations, what would be the extent of effect of shading devices in this view out? Another very relevant topic that was brought up in this consultation was the aspect of visual perception, which, unlike visual performance, this one is mostly subjective. So the public would be interested in evaluation methods for conveying the lit appearance of a room, of the space, besides what we normally do, which is assessments on the horizontal plane. But also potential correlates between the well-known and the metrics that we already have, that we normally use in practice, which are performance metrics, and the actual visual appearance of what we perceive of these daylight levels. The fourth theme or topic in the consultation was something that was already tackled today, which are the psychophysiological or biological or non-visual circadian related effects of daylight, as you want to call them. So most of the questions that we gather from this topic revolve around the idea of how to actually address this issue, this problem. So to begin with, some of the questions were around the effects of light color in general, not just daylight, but light in general. The effects of light color on our biological clock, on our circadian system. Also, the use of dynamic lighting systems that could somehow replicate the patterns and the dynamics of daylight and its integration into the design process. Benefits and limitations of human-centric designs focused on these non-visual aspects or non-visual considerations versus what we normally do, which is visual performance. So yeah, advantages, disadvantages, benefits, limitations, one versus the other or both of them together, if that's compatible at all. For example, by doing sunlight studies for circadian entrainment in courtyards or school patios. Also in line with this, the need to integrate non-visual performance metrics. We have heard today about the MEDI, but also we have the equivalent melanopic lags or some others out there. And how to make this meaningful, again, and understandable for stakeholders. Finally, on this topic, the possibility of circadian enhancement using VR or augmented reality systems for northern regions, northern latitudes during the winter season, where these regions normally lack of daylight and sunlight, but mostly sunlight. The last two topics that were brought up, post-occupancy evaluation studies. First, the need for practical methodologies to measure daylight and conduct post-occupancy evaluation campaigns in completed projects and occupied buildings. How to do that, how to address that. The potential here, someone was suggesting, could be to use this data to test the validity of PRE guidelines, which is something that was mentioned before, like discussion around whether those targets still apply, are still valid. But also it would be useful to correlate design and performance with our prediction values. So in a way, to also validate and calibrate computational workflows. Then finally, and potentially, at least for me, the most appealing topic that was brought up in the consultation, and that I've decided to call planning matters. Here we received 3 actually very intertwined suggestions. The first one refers to the lack and need of large-scale city studies that would somehow help us steer the wheel around site layout and planning policies. Potentially, as a second step, the use of urban fabrics as real-world descriptions of daylight and sunlight levels. And ultimately, the idea would be to promote guidance based on national and local planning agendas, trying to avoid somehow the one-size-fits-all approach that we are all very used to in practice. So yeah, with that we conclude the presentation of results of the consultation, and now I leave the floor to the next.
Okay, thank you. Just before we go, any questions? Sorry about that. Okay. I think we had altogether, was it about 15?
Yes.
About 15 now.
Responses.
I think we were hoping for a bit more. And we think maybe some of the practitioners are a bit shy. It was anonymous anyway, unless you offered to. I mean, hopefully this forum will encourage. Now, I mean, one thing certainly that comes through there is that there's a lot of things that actually dovetail with both what Mandana and Cosmin were describing. It seems like there's things there that kind of could be put together and dovetailed. But I mean, they're still not close enough yet for sort of definite deployment for some things. But I think there's an awful lot that's heading towards that way. And again, the BRE is a different perspective. I think that is more applied, which is what you'd expect. Yeah, things like that. But again, academia can sort of it's like, should academia lead? Should it follow, or should it kind of meet in the middle? Well, questions to debate. So. Oh, Cosmin.
John, a quick question. Is there any intention to keep this consultation going in one way or another? Like being open, keeping this open to comments at any point in time to see what they might say?
Well, it's something that's very easy to do, and the Daylight Group's a good platform for it. So perhaps we should sort of think of something. I mean, if only really as a means of getting ideas for themes for future talks.
Yeah, I think that.
Because that's something that we're always welcome of. Madonna.
I also think that this would, I mean, it seems like a very interesting way of bringing the two together. So if it's ongoing, because I can see like a lot of the points that you made there, we are also looking at it, but maybe sometimes it can be better and sometimes the talking can be better. So, or more communication is needed, such as the one that we are doing now. So this if it continues, I think it would be very useful to, have the continuation communication as well.
Given that all 3 of you are on the Daylight Group committee, I'll leave you to organise these things.
Sure. Support each other.
Okay, so now.
There's one question.
Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering if, and apologies that I didn't submit any responses.
Lisa,
crazy. Apologies.
You're going to still do it in the future.
Yeah, in the next round, I'm sure I will. I was wondering if there was no indication about the net zero agenda and the connection with other regulations and the synergies that daylight can have in terms of energy. And obviously others have talked about shading, but specifically as a benefit, not only for the person, but also for the building in terms of savings and energy savings. There was no reference whatsoever.
I think it's, there's an awful lot of money in the energy research,
Yeah,
but they
that's why
tend to be
I'm surprised that nothing has.
not interested.
Yeah.
But that's, again, that's a little bit short-sighted, seen as overheating's a hot topic, and it's like, oh dear me, windows, they can be a source of solar.
No, it was
gain
just in the way that disciplines shouldn't be seen in isolation, but as an holistic approach, and that's what is usually sometimes perceived the problem with daylight, which is delegated to second choices and priorities given to others, because it's not seen as an holistic intervention, at least in buildings and in planning in cities.
I think the closest to that we've seen is the question around shading systems and how to whether integrate them or not, and how to address that issue, also in terms of view out. But yeah, but that was it. Brilliant.
Maybe a suggestion could be to open up the questionnaire or to other practitioners that look at other subjects as well.
It actually went out to the Daylight Group. Maybe we can, I think there might be issues about sending it out to people who are not, or just putting an open one on LinkedIn. I think we can probably do it, but there's some.
But what about CIBSE as a group? Not
Yeah.
the Daylight Group within CIBSE, but CIBSE
Yeah.
as a whole, because
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we should try and
type
broaden
studies.
things as much as possible. Okay, so one of our first practitioner slots, speaker, somebody who wants to elaborate on their suggestions. So, Peter Defoe, which I'm sure all practitioners, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I think a lot of you will know me. I got my doctorate, professional doctorate in the built environment, studying the validity of daylight calculations in right to light cases. Currently, my main activity is as counsellor to rights of light surveyors. It's seeking membership of the RICS. So I bridge academe with practice. Much of what I'm going to talk about is a surveyor's perspective rather than academic perspective. I picked that little quote out the other day, put it onto LinkedIn for people. It just very succinctly expresses why the study of daylight and adequate daylight is such a difficult and contentious issue.
Not working. Oh,
I can click it across on the screen.
sorry, huge. Try that.
Right.
Does that work?
Yeah, there we go. Right, so starting off on rights of light, what are the issues? Waldron tests now are over 100 years old and distrusted by many rights of light surveyors. If you ask them for their honest opinion, they'll say, we don't actually believe that it's right. Available illuminances are believed to be much greater than assumed. Cosmin can probably prove this for us. Uniform sky model doesn't represent reality. Even the CIE sky models are subject to question. Many surveyors don't believe that 1 foot candle of direct illuminance is adequate. Waldron's proof of illuminance requirements is poorly documented. In fact, all of his research is very poorly documented. And from a surveyor's perspective, judges are consistently making their decisions on the adequacy by visiting the site. They're not actually trusting the surveyor's conclusions. And the law only changes incrementally. So documented research is essential, but it'll have to be done in easy bite stages. We won't be able to change the law suddenly. We've got to convince the courts that there is another way of looking at it. Like radiance have actually been rejected in court. So we've got to be very careful about what we do. So this quote at the top, what is sufficient daylight according to the ordinary notions of mankind? This came from a case in 1904. It's Coles versus Home and Colonial Stores. Waldron didn't start his research until 1907, and it wasn't until the 1920s that he was actually mentioned as having given expert evidence in court. So what's the minimum level of daylight illuminance required as opposed to the ideal? We're not dealing with the research that you might have done on what is the ideal level. We're dealing with what is the absolute minimum for ordinary use. And what percentage of the working plane has to be lit to that level or more in order for the room to appear adequately lit. And this is adequately lit in law, and remember the quote at the beginning. And the question, using climate-based modelling, can we assess the proportion of daylight hours when a room should appear adequately daylit or sufficient in law? You can't ever get 100% satisfaction in this sort of study. It's usually set at about 80%. And can the room be modelled accurately in a virtual environment such that alternatives can be tested? VR has been mentioned a few times. Validation of the VR is the most difficult issue. We're a few years away from being able to do that properly, but it will give the ability to be able to test alternatives. You'll get a baseline and you'll be able to test alternatives. So I just clarified there, the daylight illuminance is required. It's a single point or set of points. This is task-based. Somebody sitting there reading a copy of the Times, copying out, nothing more. And then looking at it, if you achieve that level over a percentage of the room, would the room itself appear adequately lit? There's no question in law that suggests that we look at adequacy of the overall room. The impression one gets from Waldron's research is it's only the front half, in effect. So the benefits, and these are all ifs. If climate-based modelling can be used to define available luminance, then the assessment of minimum illuminance on the working plane can be more accurate. We're moving from getting a uniform sky to what actually is provided from a sky. If we can establish a proper minimum daylight illuminance requirement with published research, then that could alter a surveyor's advice in future cases. It's got to be established, it's got to be reported, it's got to be validated, and then somebody like myself, but younger, will stand up in court and give evidence on the basis. And then this is me looking forward to the future. If a VR model can be validated and used to model alternatives, then that could be presented to a judge or other tribunal to demonstrate impact without relying on a site visit. Remember, if a judge goes to site, he's going to see it as the weather is, as the time of day is, as he feels, because we've all heard earlier about we feel differently at different times of the day. If you can model it in a virtual environment and present it, you can say to the judge, okay, what time of day, what time of year, what do you want to see on the wall finishes? So you can make your judgment. If you start with this, you end with that. Is it something that is a legal nuisance? So that's the potential for VR, but it is probably about 5 years off, I would say. So then I just turn briefly, and I've written about this, and John has got an article from me, which sometime will go out. Some questions on BR 209. The first one, does a 27% VSC set the bar too high? And we've seen cases where surveyors are trying to justify 15% because that is what is acceptable in an area. VSC, the diagram for VSCs was based upon what was available back in the 70s, 80s. Maybe it's too high. It's worth looking at. The second one, is a 21% reduction suddenly noticeable when 20% isn't? Why do we suddenly, in generic terms, say we go from a pass to a fail? That doesn't make sense to me, and I think there's a gradation of missing the target, missing the guidance. Third one, does a no sky contour of 80% mean the room is relatively uniformly daylit, or might less suffice? In rights of light, we're talking about 50, 55%. Has that ever been challenged? Has it been researched again with modern technology? The fourth one, why did the new daylight factor in luminance test use the medium, not the average? Doesn't make sense to me. Medians are nice mathematically, but they don't tell you what the room looks like. And the last one there, are the stated minimum values too high for ordinary dwellings? Bearing in mind that rooms that would have passed the ADF are now failing. And I think this was mentioned in yours, wasn't it? Challenging it. This last one is very, very contentious, equating rights of light with BR209. At the moment, you can't, and you shouldn't, and you mustn't. BR209 suggests minimum values which appear aspirational rather than actual necessity. It's not the same as a level accepted by law. If a sensible legal minimum can be defined, then it might be possible to do both tests. And the methodology could theoretically be the same, but the end value target would be different. I've just thrown in an example there. A target VSC value of 15% might produce adequate daylight subject to the no sky contour under BR209, but a value of 10% or less might be sufficient in rights of light. So that's something that we could look at. Again, this would be down the line. It'd be a case of having a proper test bed in which you can assess would they both give a sensible, repeatable same answer. And that's nice and quick. I have to get off, I'm afraid. Thank you.
So any questions for Peter?
Obviously, the VSC is a useful test, but it's also quite a blunt tool, isn't it? It's a node point, isn't it? So if you're looking at daylight within the room, etc., then you need to look at a lot of other factors like the area of glazing, etc., etc. So how would you foresee that being fed into the overall sort of calculation consideration?
Which would have been rights of light.
Generally, you're talking about VSCs there.
The thing is that the way that BR209 speaks is about noticeability. So if you start with a constant and you end with a different constant, you then have to judge whether the difference is noticeable. And it's not ever telling you whether it's adequate. And that's why we had that case where certain people were criticised because they hadn't included the no sky contour, because then that tells you how far the daylight's penetrated. So if you took a VSC of 27 with a 1 square foot window, you're not going to get daylight penetration that you get if you've got 2 square meters of window. And I think those two together have to work in tandem. But if you do the research, if you work out that a 15% VSC will provide enough daylight to a room if 75% of the working plane can receive daylight. If you can justify that, validate it, goes a long way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's also, in terms of daylight distribution, that is also a useful but has its limitations, because it's really just, can you see the sky or not? Doesn't mean to say how much you can see. So it's trying to use both those tools together. But
you have to work on a basis of what's reasonable. You can't play. If somebody's done their walls like this, then the amount of illuminance you get from internal reflection is not the same as if it's white walls. But since BR209 is concentrating on noticeability, if you can start with a point where it's reasonable and justifiable, then you can look at, does a 20% reduction in either or both mean that the loss is noticeable? But it's all subjective. You know, you need less light than I do. At my age, I need a lot of light. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm switching the lights on.
Got any questions from there? Okay, so thank you, Peter. So I think we're going to move on now, hopefully to our online. Rory, are you there? If so, click your microphone on.
I'm here, if you can hear me.
Great. Now, can you share your screen? Hopefully, It should work.
Well, I was planning on speaking to the camera, John, so I'm not sure what the best way to do that is.
Well, I mean, you're on the. Can you? Is it allowing you to share your screen with us?
Yeah, I can do that, but I just don't have much to show you.
Well, if you just want to talk, that's fine.
Yeah. So I will at some point share my screen. I do have 1 or 2 slides to share, but it wouldn't be worth showing them for the entire 10 minutes.
Or we can just share your screen just so we can see you actually. Well, so room.
Okay. Is that something? I mean, could you give me a bit of direction on this? If I share my screen, you're just going to see my desktop.
Could you just? Is your camera on?
Sure,
I mean, if your camera's on,
my camera is on.
so people can see it. I think as one of the as one of the online participants, but we can't see you in the room here. So, but I think if you share your screen and you've got the camera on yourself.
Yeah, you can see him.
Okay.
John, is it not possible to change your screen to
Probably. Why don't you just talk?
Okay.
Imagine what you're on.
I'll do that. So, so thanks for the opportunity to present briefly today, and thanks for facilitating the remote dial-in. I'll jump straight to it. I'll start with the claim that for most people, minimum daylight standards are abstract animals. You know, if you think of a reported temperature like 10 degrees centigrade, that's something that most people can imagine pretty easily. Or a waiting time of 10 minutes, that's also something that most people can relate to. But an illuminance of 150 lux over 50% of the working plane is not something that most people can easily picture in their mind's eye. This is a challenge. This is the challenge that I guess what I'm proposing today sets out to address. I think it's got universal relevance, but I'm pitching it today as something that might be of particular interest to the planning professionals that work in our local authorities. I'm zoning in on planning professionals and local authorities because in many ways they are being asked to act as de facto daylight practitioners in many cases. In contrast to other aspects of a development's design, which are applied in a mandatory way, let's say room sizes or unit mixes or parking standards, which are usually applied on a mandatory basis, and which are easy to handle because it's simply a case of checking whether they're there or not, and it's a pass-fail sort of scenario. Daylight traditionally has been employed with discretion by local authorities, and that when you introduce discretion into the equation, it places an obligation on planners in many cases to begin to use their own judgment about whether daylight is acceptable or not. I mean, I'm thinking of that in particularly instances where a planner assessing a particular scheme is presented with a report that includes points of non-conformity, and the dilemma I think that they face is, you know, if I'm to go back to what I alluded to at the start, it's very difficult, I imagine, for a planning professional, for anybody really, to imagine in their mind's eye what a particular daylight condition means or would look like, to relate the numbers in the tables in the reports to an actual understanding of what that means for the rooms that are being proposed in the proposed scheme. And I think that's a problem because it's when planning professionals are being asked to carrying out this weighing up exercise to use their personal judgment, it's hard if you can't fully picture the disamenity that would be caused by daylight departures. It's hard to attribute appropriate weight to that disamenity when you're trying to balance that against the benefits that a scheme might provide. Which brings me to the basic premise of this proposal here today. I guess the central question is, can we assist local authorities with this problem by providing them with a way of gaining direct experiential knowledge of minimum daylight standards, and how could that be done? So it's at this point I might be able to share something.
That happening.
On the way.
You need to show on your screen.
Is that visible?
No, I think because we set this up for presenter and other view.
Can you click on the Teams icon?
I have to.
Just wait, share.
No, it's not giving that. No. Sorry, it's not.
That's okay. I can do my best to
Yeah.
to talk through it instead. So the question is, how might you go about providing the planning professionals that work in local authorities with the opportunity to gain a direct experiential understanding of a minimum daylight standard? And I guess one approach that I think might be worth exploring, and I'm going to present it as a very kind of the faint outline of a possible approach, would be to try and tune a room or calibrate a room to a daylight minimum. So the basic elements that I think you would need to try and achieve that goal would be a test room, and that in my mind would be just a normal room in the wild, you know, a living room in any apartment in a city. Within that room there'd be a coarse array of illuminance sensors placed at working plane height. I mentioned a coarse array because I think it would be important for the participants who were invited into the space to be able to move around easily and to be able to view the room from different angles and interrogate it. The next element would be a way of recording or reading the illuminance levels in real time. And because a coarse array of illuminance sensors is probably likely to be most suitable, I think it would also be necessary to figure out some way of spatially interpolating between the illuminance readings that are coming back from the sensors in real time. In practice, you know, you might define a grid of 20 squares over the working plane, and you'd place the sensors in 6, for example. If you were using 6 sensors, you'd place the sensors to collect the illuminance data for 6 of those squares, and then using spatial interpolation, you'd figure out the illuminance levels for the remaining 14. And that might be a fair approach in a simple room on the assumption that daylight distributes smoothly within a space. I guess maybe the most important element of the setup would be a way of calibrating the light that enters the room. And there's probably a few ways that could be achieved. In my mind, the simplest approach would be to try doing it with something like opaque strips of film that you'd sequentially add to the inner side of the glazing within the windows that serve the room. And that by recording the data in real time, the illuminance data in real time, you'd be able to figure out how many strips to add to the window, so that ultimately you would achieve a particular daylight minimum condition. For example, 150 lux over 50% of the working plane within a living room. And then I suppose with certain safeguards, having created that scenario and having established that it was stable, it would then be possible to invite participants, in this case planning professionals from local authorities, to enter the room and to observe it, to consider the adequacy of the daylight that's being provided, to critique it and to discuss it, I suppose. The main benefits I see in this are, providing that level of experiential knowledge would close a massive gap that I see at the moment. I think it would provide planning professionals with the frame of reference that they need in order to be able to appraise departures from daylight standards that they encounter in the planning applications that come across their desk. But equally, I think it would be very beneficial, for daylight consultants that might consider volunteering with this sort of initiative to be seen as kind of constructive actors that are prepared to support planning authorities with this problem. I, for one, I think I'd learn a lot personally, and I'd be fairly enthusiastic about the idea of by volunteering to run this sort of a workshop for local authorities, gaining the opportunity to really meet them and discuss daylight and its significance within the wide range of considerations that they're faced with when they're trying to determine whether an application deserves to be granted planning permission or not. Apologies, I wasn't able to get visualizations going on that, but
sorry about that. Yes, you were more on the radio rather than the TV.
Okay.
Nostalgia dimension there. Are you? Is that you done? Yes.
I'm still here. That's my presentation. At the end, I've got to the end of it. But maybe the only thing I'd say is it's a very sketch proposal, and maybe the main reason I felt I should come and just talk to it a bit is because I really value any ideas or feedback or comments that people might have about the ideas, merits or validity or problems.
Thank you, Rory. So, yeah. Similarities, I think, with what Peter was saying in terms of an emphasis on the experiential part and the physical measures there. So, any questions for Rory? Yeah, Madonna.
I'm just like, as I said, I've arrived here in UK 6 months ago, and I think this question about the minimum requirements is a little bit new to me, and probably it's also the maximum requirements, and it seems very interesting, but it kind of feels that it's a topic that is being discussed a lot. I'm just wondering, am I correct, or is it?
It relates in part to the European standard because the values, again, which were informative, not normative, in the original phrasing were set rather high. And even though
does it have to do with the UK climate as well? Because, because it's really difficult, I guess, to meet those standards. So, I mean, in Sweden, I know that they have basically eliminated some of the requirements completely because it's not possible to
yes, Sweden's got
and
in fact they've got
so it's like a Northern European issue at the moment. Yeah, that's what I wanted to.
They've got an opinion piece which hopefully will be in the special issue of LR&T on that. So yes, it is difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all for daylight in a European standard which covers so many different latitudes, but and climate locales. So, Simone, you.
Mine was more, well, maybe if I can share this, but we are looking at potentially producing something that would go and help with this particular subject. I mean, I agree with Rory that we become very used to looking at results, but not so much as matching them with experience. So
Yeah.
the experiential side of data and sunlight is definitely something that maybe, you know, research could help, you know, bring into practice. You know.
There's a reason why you see so many papers on simulation and relatively few on measurements, and certainly nothing on extensive measurements, because there's about 2 or 3 orders of magnitude difference in cost. If you were to try and measure in a space for a whole year hourly, just at one point, let alone hundreds of them, it would be a huge endeavour, whereas simulation, you can knock that up in an afternoon. Yes. Okay, so we're nearly ready to round off. I think I have to try and get back to what I think we had before. So let's start. I need to share that one and get back to here. Okay, we're back to this. So Simone, you have a slide.
I have, yeah, I've really focused and produced one slide, and this is it. And the reason why I produced just one slide is because the whole point of this meeting was to try and inspire a little bit of conversation, debate, discussion. So I didn't very much want it to present on well, my opinions, but I wanted to try and put a few images on and see if this could stimulate a bit of conversation amongst practitioners, or that may share some stories, or, you know, people in research that may want to comment. So in a nutshell, you can see 3 different measurements taking place. I purposely not disclose whether this is ABF or, you know, SDA or, wait, that's not the point. The point here is more about scale and context and application in the real world of whatever measurement we come up with. And as a practitioner, I personally face all of this at once. You know, I start having to understand through the design of individual flats how light will distribute with a given design and whether or not that is appropriate. And then I repeat that about 500 times in a single block. Sometimes there is a dozen blocks, and that presents its own challenges. And all of a sudden, this problem becomes, well, you can see the difference yourself. I've taken all of the walls out. So right at the bottom, there is very little light, and there is probably too much light at the top if we take overheating into account. But this is no real crazy scenario. This is just a square tower in the middle of a city, and there are more and more of those going up. And then I need to place this and help in the planning process to situate it there. And what I've presented there is a little study of context that we ran for Camden. And that slice cuts at the first residential floor across the entirety of the area of Camden. And then it averages as many points on a facade per individual plot. So the whole idea there was to visualize the fact that if you are in an historic central activity zone on the first residential floor, you never average, 15 plus or 27. That becomes actually much more the case in the outer Camden areas. And then there is a Camden Town Centre area there, which is somewhere in between, right? And again, the whole point of this was to, if you were to place this, is this in context here, but not in context there, would the same metric or minimum recommendation be appropriate for this density, or in here or in there? Anyway, this is kind of what we face every day. So I just wanted to give you a little bit to go with, and then ask you, like, what's your experience and how can research, take this into account? Because obviously, if you're working in a room, you're in control of a lot of variables. But the minute you stack it, all of a sudden, you multiply your problems. And that's the reality. And then, as you want to slot it into the context of planning, city development, agenda, what do you do? Please.
Yeah, it is amazing and somehow exciting to see graphs these scales. By the way, my name is Daniel and I'm a researcher at UCL. And it is interesting because in my opinion, I think the daylight field is not as developed as the thermal field, in the sense that, for instance, 10 years ago, CIBSE released a methodology to assess overheating in dwellings. From a theoretical and academic point of view, it was a very compelling method. And it was nice and it looked like, oh, listen, we just solved it. But then when they enforce it and consultancies start playing with it and trying to assess it, they realize that it was so thorough that it was impossible to comply with. So what happened is that then CIBSE went back and released an amendment and released a series of things that make possible to comply. So that's probably what the daylight field is kind of missing at the moment. Something that says, listen, you asked me to do all this, but if we look at the way it is employed and the way the city is being built, it's probably not the best way to focus your efforts in.
We had a bit of that with the European standard in that those recommendations were indeed too high. At the drafting stage, people didn't see a problem with that because it's a recommendation. However, in countries, and actually particularly in Britain, they start to take informative to mean normative. And so then people just fixated on what were really aspirational values as being normative minima, and they weren't. So, yeah, I think, Dana, you had your...
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you present this problem, but I just wanted to say from the research side, we also think that there are different ways to approach this problem. Like when it comes to the facade itself, I think the architects, or I don't know, whoever decides about the orientation of the building and how the facade should lie, I think and in a lot of cases, it's not considered that the orientation is different and you don't need to have the same exact facade for every orientation. And this is not being considered because on the educational side, probably is quite a big gap between what is aesthetic and what is performative. So probably some of this starts from education and more effort that is required for bringing the level of understanding. But this is, I mean, it's not that we are not talking about, but there is I agree with you that there is a gap of this understanding. Like, why are we using simply like the same facade everywhere? Or if you're using the same shading, or if you're considering even using a shading, it would be exactly the same for all the orientation. And this continues being the same issue of the repetition and simplicity that comes in and kind of ruins all the
all the research.
All the research.
If I can comment on that. Well, but I think that you actually hit the nail on the head there. It ruins the research because the research, is abstract to some extent, even though in a subject like daylight, that's the title we gave to this presentation, is applied science. I would add cost to it. If you've ever been in a design team meeting and you offered as a solution to make all of the floors with different glazing sizes, and then the orientation as well, you'll be met, with BISCON, and maybe you're a bit too naive to the whole process of putting a building together in the real world. So you hit the nail on the head. I think reality sometimes ruins the research, but sometimes research needs to deal with the fact that the way to affect how that building will perform is to be in that meeting room and trying to bridge the gap. So
I'd be happy to come next time. Please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add a couple of things?
Of course.
And that relates to, and the planning in UK. and that's in response to Roy as well, the majority of planners know nothing, know anything about daylighting. So that's a major issue. But I agree with your approach of putting the context in what the planners need to justify if you need to go below a certain threshold, because planners exclusively use BR 209. That's their Bible reference. Even the new standard is marginally used. So that's one problem. The issue is that quite often the planners, without knowledge, and I agree, training is absolutely mandatory, and across all the councils, and in particular on city centres, GLA should do more of that. I agree. The issue is that quite often they need to go to planning committees and they have lots and lots of complaints and they need to negotiate. There are lots of contradictory aspects on the table. There is requirements for the applications, and then there is an issue, how do you actually distribute? Because potentially on that tower building, some percentage will be social housing. How do you locate? Because there will be potentially an indication to say, okay, top buildings, great views, daylight will be for private owners and the bottom ones. And so there is a need to justify, and I agree, your approach of saying, in the context of the city, if you need to go for densifying the city, there will be compromises to be made. But the issue that needs to be in the agenda is how to minimize probably the people that will be more affected, which usually is the social housing percentage. So I would, and I know that that doesn't apply across. There are some developers that try or mention that anything is randomly allocated. The reality is that it's not, and everybody knows.
That could be an interesting applied research, not in terms of the metric. Hence why I didn't want to focus this on a metric, which we all actually very happy to debate and discuss. There could be maybe a way to write recommendations that takes into consideration what are some of the issues that you encounter day in, day out when you're applying a building into the real world, and maybe writing that those recommendations could help, could help minimize the playing around with the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely, and cost needs to be equated in that as well. But that's not to be derivative to associate a cheaper flat is the one that is going to be allocated for social housing or whatever, that usually it's the case. So, but I agree with your approach, and I know you've been using it for many years, and there is a little bit of constraint. The question is, how far can you go? And that's where the research is. It needs to be much more detailed across, because to say in this area is like that is okay. We know that if I'm going to buy a flat in the city centre, maybe I don't get that much daylight. If I'm aware of that as a first principle, maybe I know that I will need to go outside to catch more daylight. But there are issues that planners are very, very concerned. And just one suggestion, and I know you have as well, the View City, visual tools will help enormously, not only the planners, but the councillors that ultimately give the decision to approval on a project. So it's not just experiential, which will be restricted to one room that maybe not be representative of the clear scenario, but something more virtually reality with your view city, whatever you want to call it, to promote more and show the case to planners.
Very quick comment. I agree with what Louisa said. I just wanted to add something because you mentioned BR 209. And obviously in this in this context or this discussion, I just wanted to point out that there is some flexibility in the guidelines. So even if many planning officers
don't see it as such.
Sorry?
They see planners don't see it as such. They see there is on BRE some level and they apply
I
it.
just wanted to clarify that because I agree that many of them don't have a full understanding of the guidelines, but we say very clearly that the guidelines are flexible. I mean, should be interpreted flexibly. They are there as, you know, some guidelines basically. Obviously, they are not normative, but yeah, you're right. So I guess training is something that should
absolutely.
be
You should disseminate as much
scale.
as possible.
And about the visualization, that's a very useful tool. I fully agree. We just have to be cautious with its validation, and you know, because every time you look at pictures, for instance, you know, there's a certain potential inaccuracy that could be introduced by, I don't know, the screens, the whatever medium is used. So this is obviously lots of research work to be done. So yeah, having said that, I guess there is a lot of potential for research studies to try and address the problem that Simone is presenting. And this is a very common issue, as we know. So yeah.
If I may, just I agree the flexibility is in there, but that we should try and move forward from the fact that having that flexibility is obviously a great tool for interpretation. What do we measure the flexibility with, for instance, or against? Because we don't really have minimum on the one hand, which would be an area research, as we heard, that could be very interesting. My feeling is that minimum will be so little that it is impractical to a certain degree, but that's just my hunch. But the other end of the spectrum is flexibility, and you know, we've been trying to work out how do you make flexibility apparent or experiential, visual, you know, ever since, because I don't think it's necessarily that, or I haven't really met any local authority or council that wants 100% compliance. So they got enough information that when you're trying to deliver a scheme, some rooms or some flats will not meet the minimum guidance. But how far do you take it? That's a question mark. And where are you doing it? Therefore, what's the expectation? It's another question mark. You know, so I don't know, I think that the part of what we could do now is try and venture out and study more than rooms, you know, and more than single events that occur in one room. But for instance, study more of the outside, more of the fabric, more of how it all ties together with living, for instance, and the quality of living, which I know it moves us away from the subject of daylight, but all of a sudden it actually brings daylight back into the
post-pandemic
center.
Transition to, you know, to immense amount of home working is yeah, it's a huge consideration now.
That to be honest, like, is another very interesting subject, right? Because it's ever shifting, ever moving.
There are a number of studies now focused around the home office environment and indeed on illumination. Yeah. So yeah, in fact, one of those in Eindhoven that I'm aware of. Yeah, should be finishing shortly, I think. Yeah.
I think it opens up other areas of research. Yes.
I had a comment to add to that. You mentioned how far do you take it? So you come across a non-compliant scheme and it would be over a 20% reduction, let's say. So from my understanding, that applies nationwide, but for city centres, in particular London and the GLA, they could have their own standards. And I've come across a council hearing that stated BSc in the mid-teens is considered acceptable. So I would reference that in my report as a justification to support the planning application, but there's no like clear guidance. Where did they find out that BSc for the mid-teens was acceptable? How strongly can I rely on that? Is there going to be better city centre sort of planning? Do you have any insight?
Yes. If you look at the decisions that mention the mid-teens, you can actually trace them back to the original decision, and if you want, I can pass those on. But if you think about the GLA area, that's GLA area, and you can see it's 3 completely different environments. So to say that mid-teens is acceptable everywhere, I think it's a one-size-fits-all, much like saying 27, is optimal.
It's a tricky argument to use, but
yes, and there is this.
I've been into a position where after it's my only option.
Believe you me, I've been in the same place.
Yeah.
but again, so I generally ask, the floor, how do we try and move away from, sweeping statements and create a methodology that start, tying a few loose ends together. And I love your comment about bringing in overheating or acoustics, or again, if we had a very interesting debate where there was an acoustician and a fire engineer, etc. And then it was us daylight people in the room. And amongst the 3 of us, we thought if we try and comply with all of the regulations, we're just building medieval castles. That's it. Finding windows with massive walls that don't catch fire. And it can't be that you do all of that research that in isolation seems to work, like what you were saying about the original CIBSE. And then when you try to apply, the acoustics won't let you open the window anymore. If you don't open the window, you overheat, and the windows become smaller and smaller. The walls become thicker and thicker with rock wool. We need to kind of bring it back into.
I mean, people.
What's the outcome? Where you want to live. And anyway.
People let the simulation kind of run away with it now, because you can do an awful lot of this stuff. Now, it's easy to conflate different modelling modalities, and a lot of this stuff happens, but at every step you've got uncertainties, and these things now pile up so enormously that the credibility of the output is dubious. But then they can say, but it was optimized by AI and all of this sort of stuff and whatever goes. But underlying it is, let's say, weather data or something like that, and there are uncertainties in that. So it's I think all these there's a couple of points I'll finish on, so I won't spoil it. So
I'm done unless there are more questions. It wasn't to stimulate some conversation. So
just highlight the point that was made about multi-domain type of approaches in research. I guess it was also some of the slides of me that John deleted in my presentation to try to emphasize the importance of this. So I think it's really good that this was brought up here. And I think there are also several research groups that are working on this approach, but then again, it is still takes time and it's new, and to understand the interaction between each of these domains, thermal, air quality, acoustics, and visual by itself is lengthy and takes time, but it might not.
And again, reality may be, pushing down for simpler and simpler solutions, but that maybe could be a way to, or lens through which to look at the recommendation and research.
one of the mindsets that we could apply to this is that you do the complex stuff, not so that you've got justification for doing the complex stuff, but you're finding the bare minimum that gets you where you need to go, irrespective that you can do so much stuff that's cool. It's like, we don't necessarily cool, we need sort of, you know, the, what was it? I think it was Einstein that said, make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. Yes. Can we, at this point, so thank you. We're very nearly done. So here's a couple of things that kind of fit in with everything that we've been talking. And so benchmarking of CBDM prediction software. So people using different software tools, are they all delivering the same results? Now, with thermal, airflow, there's quite a number of tools are accredited by bodies like CIBSE because they pass certain tests. We don't have them in daylight simulation. We've got sort of academic studies. I mean, Eleonora Brembila did a number of those comparing different radiance methods of CBDM and things like that. So we have got the basis for that, and there is indeed a CIBSE-led effort to provide benchmarking approaches, you know, pro forma for CBDM. It is a volunteer effort, so it moves at the speed that volunteer efforts move, which is not always as fast as we'd like, but that is happening. Something else, this is absolutely essential, in situ validation of CBDM predictions. Now, this is not straightforward, and, you know, right way back in 2014, me and Axel discussed this in some articles, ping-ponging. You know, it is very difficult to validate. Turns out actually just the ordinary daylight factor is actually extremely difficult. However, it's not impossible, and you need approaches that can work in real life buildings. So that means not starting off on the horizontal. I mean, all the metrics may be on the horizontal and so forth, but we actually start off in a place that's not going to be confounded and interfered by people putting books on top of it and sitting on it and whatever, everything else. So it's about having a few datum points. They need to be in kind of free space, high up on a wall, that are looking at the sort of prevailing illumination in the space, and they're not some localized illumination microclimate. I mean, something that we picked up from work with the National Trust, we looked at sort of handwells, and hold on, this handwell light logger, it's on this lovely varnished worktop, you know, some elegant bit of furniture from hundreds of years ago, and it's facing this window, and you get your little iPhone fisheye camera adapter, and you take a photo from that photocell's view, and it's got this fantastic specular reflection it's picking up off the window. So what that photocell is measuring is not the illumination that you can really is representative. It's a very localized illumination. So you need some datum point that's not influenced by a localized illumination microclimate. And then if you can simulate that reliably, you know that's your starting point for saying, okay, now then, what's the relation between that point and here? So you can start to use inferential sort of validation, thinking at least we're getting it right in a few points there. So we're a bit more confident that, you know, of what's happening on the horizontal. So again, that is happening, and that's some work again that Eleonora and me started on, and hopefully pick up on a bit more. This is a big deal. If you're given a meter ruler, but you're only given one, you'll never know how it matches up to other meter rules. So actually it doesn't matter if it's 95 or 105. That was the case with weather files. Yeah, we didn't know if that was absolutely what happens in Gatwick, but it was the only one that you had. As soon as you've got 3 or 4, and then you look at the numbers. So this is the IWEC one from the Energy Plus website. Now on the Climate One building site, you've got the choice of 3 TMX files. So they're curated from different collections of years. They're put together by taking individual months, which are then analysed usually in terms of things like temperature more than anything else. And so you get these statistically average months from different years that are stitched together to make this one year. So this is kind of suggestive that this is just from years 07 to 21, that it's kind of more like the latest climate. If climate is changing, is it really changing? But they've actually got different methodologies of curation as well. And when you look at total global horizontal in kilolux hours, you got, well, a little bit more variance than perhaps you'd like. I mean, that's getting on for 20%, isn't it? But with CBDM, you're predicting sunlight and skylight separately. And then it's like, wow, really? Those differences are staggering, absolutely staggering. And they're there, and it's like, you know, what do you do with that? So one of the things we've done is to actually try and find some sort of, find out what's really happening at Gatwick, and looked at 10 years of data that we actually got from satellite, from the Copernicus. I started off with the radiation and then used the Perez luminous efficacy models in their component forms to get illumination. Now, we also had some data points on the ground. This came from National Trust work, and that gave us faith in the reliability of this approach, because we got staggeringly good agreement between what was measured in the grounds of 3 stately home locations with the National Trust. I've got 600 days of 1 minute, full days of 1 minute data, with what we got from the satellites. And so we thought, right, we'll look at 10 years of solar data from Gatwick. And it turned out those 10 years remarkably consistent when you look at the frequency distributions. But the worrying thing is, they don't look like any of these when you look at these distributions. And that paper's under review, but it's not inconceivable that there's something amiss with the solar data in weather files, because it's been stitched together on the back of a methodology that was designed for something that's much less variable, and that's the temperatures. So yeah, I mean, this sets off alarms anyway. You do not have this amount of variation year to year in the annual total. You don't get it in frequency distributions. And lastly, this was coming up all the time, I think, experienced daylight exposure in real buildings, and how this relates to predictive metrics. So this really means monitoring of personal light exposure. Yeah, so a lot of people are doing this. Again, it's one of these things where the sensors can be relatively cheap, but I think they're an essential thing to just collect, but also collect in a form that you can carry out large meta-analyses afterwards, that you can put the different studies together. Because at the moment, they've got so much missing gaps, it's very difficult to make a meta-study of them. And another thing that none of these studies at the moment are doing, and again, we've just got paper in that's got a recommendation for this, for how you carry out meta-analysis studies on personal light exposures. This is work happening at Eindhoven that I'm involved in. And that's actually to use, from what we've seen in the satellite data and it being reliable, to actually give the latitude and longitude and the time that these evaluations were taken, because unless you've got a weather station nearby to a personal exposure study, you don't have any idea what's happening with the outside conditions reliably. But from the satellite data, we can go back to 2004 and you just say when and get the data done in minutes for that. So you can get idea of the boundary conditions. When these surveys are carried out, what was the weather outside like? So these are things that are kind of researchy things that are happening, that are kind of reaching a stage of where they can start to find real world sort of application. But just before we carry on with the discussion, I'd just like to go through the acknowledgements. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank GIA for hosting this, Simone and Victoria, everything they put in to get this event together. Paul Littlefair, Cosmin, Mandana, Rory, even though he was only on the radio, and Peter Defoe. Yeah, and everyone who has participated online and in person. Hopefully the sound was good there. So we'll carry on the discussion. We'll try and pick up on some comments. But I think some beers are on offer, so we may struggle with picking up on the comments. So on that, but if you put them down there in the chat, then perhaps people can look at them later on and get back to them. So again, thank you everybody for participating in this event.